What's going on, everybody? Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what's going on right here. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do, and subscribe if this is what you're looking for. Welcome to a pre recorded session of a valued conversation, Gen X spoken word. So, we know the last time we got together, there was some major technical difficulties, all right, to the point that everyone could see that I was resource challenged. So, the next time that I hold a panel, I'm not going to do it on this laptop, which again, I was not really prepared to be a content creator as I am right now. But now that I know that there's a lot of information out here that needs to be covered because it is not getting to folks like yourselves, I'm going to have to up my game a little bit. So the next time that we do any type of panel shows, we're going to do that with StreamYard. But in the meantime, since this is going to be a quick burst, maybe about an hour at best, maybe an hour and 10, let's go ahead and keep it in between there, folks, somewhere like that. Again, a quick burst. I'm going to do this as a single monologue like many of you have been accustomed to me doing. So when things started getting slow, it was right about the time that Dwight had to leave. Fatty was suffering from allergies because he had his head down a lot. And then on top of that, the technical difficulties. But we had gotten to the part where we were talking about the ideology switch between the Republican and the Democratic Party. A lot of the conversation that still persists right now, when you talk to anyone from the conservative side of the aisle, oh, the parties didn't switch. The Democrats are still the same horrible people for the country as they've always been. No, that's not true. It's not. So I'm going to do what I can tonight to make sure that we quell all the nonsense and the foolery that generally comes from the conversation of, oh no, the ideologies didn't switch. They're still the same parties. Some of you may or may not know that Angry Man and I got into it about some of the conversation that we're going to have here. Myself, maybe a few other folks in the panel in these spaces, you may or may not know it, but again, I'm going to clarify that all tonight. So, what I want to do is start with the Civil Rights Acts just to lay the baseline, because believe it or not, there were actually four separate Civil Rights Acts in between the years of 1866 up until 1964, or let's say 1965, if we look at the Voting Rights Act that was passed, that helped turn things around between the parties. But what's really significant is that people don't seem to realize that there was a definitive point in time that started the shift of blacks voting for Republicans over to the Democrats. So we're going to go ahead and cover that. All right. Enough for me. Let's go ahead and get started. So, as I said before, we're not going to focus on too much, with the exception of just looking at our Civil Rights Acts. Now, we do know that during the course of Reconstruction, where after the Civil War, blacks were going to be integrated into Southern society, they had, during the Reconstruction period, Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendment, to which we've talked about. But taking those out of the picture, we're just going to look at again the Civil Rights Acts that lay the foundation of where we want to go with tonight's topic, which is the big switch, the ideology change of the Republican and Democratic parties. All right, starting with the 1866 Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark law that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It was enacted into law by Congress on 9 April 1866 due to President Andrew Johnson initially vetoing the bill. Now, if you recall, I had mentioned in the last video that Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, uh, Johnson being the Democrat, slave owners, and Lincoln being the Republican, two different parties. But you didn't see that going forward after that particular, we'll call that marriage of election capability, whatever you want to call that. After that point, we saw things where Democrats ran with Democrats, Republicans ran with Republicans. But in this particular instance, after the death of Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, being a Southerner and a Southern Democrat on top of that, was not looking at the 1866 Civil Rights Bill getting passed at all. Matter of fact, he vetoed it, just as I just mentioned above here. So, luckily, Congress did take the step to make sure that it did get passed into law. Thus, we had the foundation and the starting period of the Reconstruction era where blacks were moving into Southern society. Now, what a lot of people don't seem to think about here is that in that short 10, maybe 11 years, 1866 to 1877, there was a lot of prominence that blacks had reached in that 11-year period. There were blacks who were in Congress, Senate, local local government, schools, even building wealth and being economic forces in that short time period. There was black wealth that was accumulated as well as black prominence. So we don't know or hear a lot about that because history has been written mostly by the losers. And we talked about that when we discussed the the Confederacy's lost cause narrative. Different topic, but I'm just doing some filling. Always keep in mind now, everything that we're talking about at some point in time, if we do our research properly, there will be an intersect of history where things that we're corroborating on one side will cross into another area where we're doing our cross referencing. History is nice if we keep up with things, all right? Let's continue. All right, we have the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Now, I did not know of this particular act until maybe a few weeks ago. Because again, some of these things are not discussed in history unless you go to higher education, or if you happen to be looking for information out on the internet, you happen to come across it and you follow it through. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, signed March 1st, 1875, by President Ulysses S. Grant, spelling error. Just because I see it, I'll take care of it right now. Oops. Enacted during Reconstruction, aimed to guarantee equal access to public accommodations and outlawed racial discrimination in places like inns, public transportation, and theaters, but was later declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. Now, if you look at the time period in 1883, this is after the Reconstruction period had ended. Now, recall in the election of 1876 between Rutherford B. Hayes and I forget the name of his opponent, the first name, but the last name was Tilden. During this time frame, both of the candidates for president declared victory. But in the end, it ended up being a thing of where the South said, you know what, you guys can go ahead and let the Republicans be the winners. But what we want in exchange for compromise is for the Republican Party to remove the Union troops from the southern states. That's all we want. And upon doing so, because the South knew what they were doing, as soon as the Union troops left, all the advancements that had been made during those 11 years of the Reconstruction period were wiped away. Keep in mind, I just mentioned the black excellence that you've seen in Congress, Senate, local government, education, universities, the medical fields, financial. All that was pretty much just wiped away. The 1957 Civil Rights Act. Civil Rights Act of 1957, signed into law by President Dwight D. Eisenhower on September 9th, 1957, was the first major civil rights legislation since 1875, focusing on protecting voting rights by establishing a civil rights division in the Justice Department and a U.S. Civil Rights Commission. FYI, just today, Donald Trump has now made a play to get rid of said department. Just keep that in mind. Again, that's going to be a follow up video, but I want you folks to know that, again, this is not a civil rights act that was known to a lot of people. But again, it is one of the primary enforcement mechanisms of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. So, what's happening right now is, what did I say? Confederate line items that are being enacted based upon an updated approach through Project 2025 that is being sponsored by the Heritage Foundation. More in a different video, but keep that in mind. And last, of course, we have the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark law that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson on July 2nd, 1964. All right, so those are the 4 civil rights acts that I want everyone to just, just emblaze into your mind, or if you can't do that, look it up someplace and make sure that you have it ready. A piece of paper on your phone somewhere just in case it pops up in conversation. But again, that's going to be the basis of looking at why we've, essentially saw the Republican Party and the Democratic Party switch, because the Southern Democrats, also a faction inside of the Dixie Democrats, were fed up because they were seeing blacks getting rights that they did not want them to have. This is all up and down through the Jim Crow era that started shortly after Reconstruction ended, which was 1877. So Jim Crow did not officially see the end in the United States until roughly about 1965. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go ahead and get started here. So when I say get started, let's get started at looking at when did this actual shift in ideology start. Well, it started. Well, let me do this first. So it actually started, believe it or not, folks, with a flood. There we go. It all started with the Mississippi River flood of 1927. Now, again, these are things that you are just not going to hear of unless you seek higher education, or unless it's a book report that kids did in school that you come across, like I accidentally did looking for information. I came across this little book report that someone had done in school that was posted online, and reading through it, I thought to myself, "Wow, this kid has got good referencing, good information, the way they put it together, typographical style, content, format. It was quite impressive for, I guess it was a middle school kid who had done this. But I saw information that I wasn't familiar with, that I'd even heard through my time in K through 12, to include also my undergrad. Thought, okay, I have not heard this. This is some good shit. Let me go ahead and see what this goes through. And by the time I finished pulling on that thread, I had actually walked myself right up to the point to whereas, without a question, I knew where the shift of the parties began. But I'm not going to give it away just yet. So what you had here is the Mississippi River flood of 1927, and this flood had dumped water after the levees broke upon, where it's 23,000 square miles of land in Mississippi, just flooded. People displaced. I think about 250 people died. We're talking about an absolute mess. Now, when the flooding was finished, where is it around here? We're talking about 750,000 people without food, water, clothing. And the biggest issue about this, of course, if you know anything about if blacks are in the area, guess who gets the short end of the stick? So we're talking about, again, no food, water, clothing, or work. And what was typical of the time frames, that if you were black, you did not get the same type of treatment as everyone else did, which it clearly states, without food, water, clothing, or work, and authorities were severely criticized for favoring the white population during rescue and relief operations. Thousands of plantation workers, most of them African Americans, have been forced to work in deplorable conditions, shoring up the levees near Greenville, Mississippi. Then, as the waters rose, they were left stranded for days without food or drinking water, while white women and children were hauled to safety. African Americans gathered in relief camps were forced to participate in release efforts while receiving inferior provisions for themselves and to clean up flooded areas. At least one black man was shot, reportedly refusing for work. So there are other accounts of this through history where it also talked about folks literally walking up to blacks at gunpoint and forcing them to fix the levees, even though that was not their job. That was not what they were there for. But because of the situation, they were white, these guys were black, they had guns. What are you going to do? You went and you fix levees. Now, the most egregious part of this, though, is what I'm about to tell you next here. Now, at this point in time, Herbert Hoover, not yet the president, but well known in government, was the Secretary of Commerce to President Calvin Coolidge. Now, people stated that there's always advice that Hoover wanted to give, but a lot of folks went out of their way to make sure they ignored it because generally they viewed it as being bad advice. But during this time frame, Herbert Hoover was the most influential person in Washington when it came to organizing for humanitarian efforts, which takes us to, you know what? Before we do that, before we go to Herbert Hoover, let's back up for a second. Before we jump over to Hoover, let's take a look at the treatment of blacks during the flood. Now, you saw that I just mentioned information about how they were forced to work in the levees and they received poor conditions, or they were a part of poor conditions, food, clothing. They were not favored or looked at. They were generally the last people to receive anything if they did. So let's go back in here and take another look at this flood situation. The devastation of the flood and the strained racial relations resulted in many African Americans joining the Great Migration from affected areas to northern and Midwestern cities, a movement that had been underway since World War I. The floodwaters began to recede in June 1927, but interracial relations continued to be strained. Hostilities had erupted between the races. A black man was shot and killed by a white police officer when he refused to unload a relief boat at gunpoint. Near Helena, Arkansas, Owen Fleming was lynched after he killed a plantation overseer who wanted to force him to rescue the plantation owner's mules. As a result of displacements lasting up to 6 months, tens of thousands of local African Americans moved to the big cities of the North, particularly Chicago. Many thousand more followed in the following decades. So, as I said here, you can always corroborate information and it will intersect. So, you're going to always find information somewhere out here that is going to cross. And we've just done that in just two quick entries, all right? But this is where we need to start looking at how Herbert Hoover played into all this. Herbert Hoover enhanced his reputation by his achievements in directing flood relief operations as Secretary of Commerce. Remember, I just mentioned that under President Calvin Coolidge. Now, I'm going to stop right here because it talks about how the next year Hoover easily won. But what we're not seeing here is something that he did during the course of that flood. Now, we're seeing signs of blacks being mistreated, right? So let's go ahead and do a quick look at this. So if you were to go to Google and type in what I've got here, Great Flood of 1927 and Blacks Are Mistreated, it's going to give you some additional information about this time period. During the Great Flood of 1927, African Americans in the South faced significant mistreatment, including forced labor, discriminatory distribution of aid, and restrictions on evacuation, leading to widespread environmental injustice. How many of you have ever heard about this information, especially involving President to be Herbert Hoover? Anyone? No, some of this you are not going to hear because recall, the not the victors, I'm sorry, the losers wrote history, being the Confederacy, or those who romanticized the Confederacy. They wrote history. They had access to publishers who were sympathetic with the Southern plight. And as I mentioned in the last video, they were able to get the lost cause narrative into textbooks that are still being produced today. Different topic. So there's additional information that we can talk about here. Forced labor and levee crews. Black men were often rounded up and forced to work on levee crews without pay, even after the floodwaters receded. Discrimination in aid distribution. Discrimination in aid distribution. Supplies and means of evacuation were preferentially given to white citizens, while African Americans received leftovers and were often denied assistance without a voucher from a white employer. Restrictions on evacuation. Some community leaders instructed African Americans to stay on the levees for flood control and recovery efforts, fearing their labor force might not return if allowed to leave. So the injustices just keep going on and on. But the one thing that I really want people to focus on here we go, where Herbert Hoover's name gets thrown into the mix. And he's going to be our segue from here that takes us to our next article that's going to be inputted. Lack of representation and political exploitation. Reports about the poor treatment in refugee camps, including one by the Colored Advisory Commission, were suppressed by President Hoover, who sought to maintain the status quo and secure votes in the upcoming election. Now let's jump back now. The next year, now this is the previous article that we're reviewing. The next year, Hoover easily won the Republican 1928 nomination for president and the general election that year. Now look up above here. Herbert Hoover enhanced his reputation by his achievements in directing flood relief operations as Secretary of Commerce under President Calvin Coolidge. Where in here did it mention anything about the neglect that blacks suffered during that time period where he was responsible for organizing relief efforts? Where do you see it? Obviously, you don't see it anywhere. And I'm going to show you a little bit more down the road here how even though he played a part in the suffering that blacks endured during that time frame, unless you look in some place particular where you will see this, or if you know where to look for it, it's not even mentioned. Onward. All right, still more information here. So we're starting to get to the point where civil rights is about to be discussed. And Hoover, for the most part, was not really concerned about civil rights. Hoover's overall mixed reputation is a negative one on the subject of civil rights. Despite false promises to the contrary, Hoover did nothing to better the conditions for African Americans. He was not above using racial tension and prejudice to his electoral advantage, and whatever his legacy may be, he will not be remembered as a president who advanced the cause of civil rights. But I'm digressing, or should I say I'm progressing too far. Let me scroll back up here a little bit. Now, we've already talked about Herbert Hoover as far as him being someone who was good with humanitarian efforts and involving himself in such. Now, he lived in China for a little while. So he had a good background of being well cultured. Where do we see here? He and his wife Lou lived in China at the end of the 19th century, and they even learned to speak Mandarin. Good for him. He also had a good record as a humanitarian. Now, he also led humanitarian efforts in Russia. Here we go. This is after the First World War, the famine-stricken Bolshevik-controlled areas of Russia. He obviously spent some time there doing his humanitarian duties. When accused of helping Bolshevism, Hoover retorted, 21 million people are starving. Whatever their politics, they shall be fed. All right, so he was a man of the people, as you can see, right? Here we go. We just discussed this, the Great Mississippi Flood of 1927. Now, as I said before, he was a humanitarian and he was known for organizing. Although such a disaster did not fall under the duties of the Commerce Department, the governors of 6 states along the Mississippi specifically asked for Herbert Hoover in the emergency. So Coolidge sent him down there to take care of it, and as was known, he did his thing. Hoover set up health units to work in flooded regions for a year. The workers stamped out malaria, pellagra, and typhoid fever from many areas. His work during the flood brought Herbert Hoover to the front pages of newspapers almost everywhere, and he gained new accolades as a humanitarian. Recall now, we've seen the mistreatment of African Americans that was not prominently known. We'll see why in just a moment. Now, here we go, talking about, as I mentioned, the mistreatment of the African Americans. But the treatment of African Americans during the disaster hurt Hoover's reputation as a humanitarian. Local officials brutalized African Americans and prevented them from leaving relief camps. Aid meant for African American sharecroppers was often given to the landowners instead, and African American males were conscripted by locals into forced labor, sometimes at gunpoint. Hoover struck a deal with Robert Moton, the prominent African American successor to Booker T. Washington, who was president of the Tuskegee Institute. Now, recall they talked about that organization that worked with, uh, that worked with Hoover in order to do something about the treatment that the black workers were being involved with. You're going to see here in a moment here that Hoover worked out a deal. Now, recall in the previous article, it talked about him winning convincingly the 1928 election, to whereas 1929, when the recession started, during I think it was the fall of Wall Street, the crash of 1929, he was president. But notice, he got into office, but without any shit on his shoe from the 1927 flood efforts. Let's continue. Hoover struck a deal with Robert Moton, the prominent African American successor to Booker T. Washington. Yeah, we just read that. In exchange for keeping the suffering of African Americans out of the public eye, uh, Hoover promised unprecedented influence for African Americans if he was elected president. Moton agreed and worked actively to keep information about mistreatment of blacks from being revealed to the media. Following election, Hoover never kept this promise, leading to an African American backlash in the 1932 election that shifted allegiance from the Republican Party to the Democrats. Boom. There is your initial catalyst. I want you to keep this in mind now. No one can ever say that there was never not a migration or a change of the parties. Hoover was the person who got it started through his own negligence. And you've just seen it for yourself. Now, there was also some dirty macking that went on with Herbert Hoover as well. Now, he is not above using bigotry to get his ways here. In the election of 1928, to gain Republican votes in southern states, Hoover used a Southern strategy. Now, we're going to be talking about that a little while here. So, the Southern strategy was basically a racist concept that appealed to the racism of white voters, white politicians, you named it. It was all about utilizing racial discrimination. Again, Southern strategy. Keep that in mind. Hoover used a Southern strategy in which he appealed to white voters and used the support of the Ku Klux Klan against his Catholic opponent. He won victories in Tennessee, North Carolina, Florida, Virginia, and Texas. It marked the first time a Republican candidate for president carried Texas. This outraged the black leadership who broke from the Republican Party and began seeking candidates who supported civil rights within the Democratic Party. Hoover seldom mentioned civil rights while he was president. Hoover believed that African Americans and other races could improve themselves with education and wanted the races assimilated into White House culture. This is what we're talking about when you think of pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Hoover attempted to appoint John J. Parker to the Supreme Court in 1930 to replace Edward Sanford. The NAACP claimed that Parker made many court decisions against African Americans and fought the nomination. The NAACP was successful in lobbying Senate support, and nomination was defeated in the Senate. Now, if you go through the article, you see that his wife was very big into supporting the African Americans and even invited folks to the White House to include Booker T. Washington. Also, maybe this will be a story down the road here, but there was a vice president or someone in the presidential circle before Barack Obama and Kamala Harris. And it was Charles Curtis, who was, well, let me just read it here. Hoover's Vice President Charles Curtis was the nation's first Native American vice president. How many of you knew that? It gets to be so much more. So much more. We may not do it in this session, but understand, God damn it, we gonna do it. So, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and roll off of this because we're getting real deep in this and we're starting to get to that time frame. We're almost at 30 minutes. Well, actually, we are at 30 minutes. One last thing here. I'm going to kind of paraphrase this, but during this time frame, we're talking about the Great Depression. We're talking about the end of World War One. You had a lot of veterans that came back and were promised bonus pay. And because of this bonus pay that they were promised, they all camped out on the steps of Washington, D.C. And I want to say it was, here we go, during June 1932. Now, being that the bonus army, as they were called, were not leaving, the Washington police attempted to get these guys gone. So that didn't work. There were some shots that were fired. And eventually, Hoover sent out Douglas MacArthur and some of famous guys that we'll see down the road here, Dwight Eisenhower and George Patton, to help stop this. Now, MacArthur had this thing about, oh, it's communism. We got to stop communism. And he took a boot and a hammer to these guys. Now, Hoover did not want that to be done, but MacArthur chose to do it his own way. But be that as it may, this did not look well for Hoover. And because of this, this probably was mainly the key things that kept him from a second term. But we've already had the discussion about how Hoover fell in the end, primarily due to false promises, as well as him not being a strong source of support for African Americans for civil rights. But understand, Hoover was the catalyst for civil rights. Now, just before we step away from that, I just want you guys to take one other look here at Herbert Hoover here. And here's the discussion of the Great Flood. Now, we've seen all the information that we discussed about Hoover, right? About how he didn't really care for assisting the blacks for civil rights, or how he really didn't care about the blacks at all. But let's just take a quick look at this. Excuse me. Known for his monumental humanitarian relief work in Europe during and after World War One, then Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover was called on to organize relief for the victims of the epic disaster. And again, they're talking about the Great Mississippi Flood. Hoover swung into action, assembling hundreds of ships to carry supplies, overseeing the creation of tent cities for refugees, and making radio and press appeals that helped raise millions of dollars for the Red Cross. I suppose I could have called in the whole army, but what was the use? All I had to do was call in Main Street itself, Hoover said later. No other Main Street in the world could have done what the American Main Street did in the Mississippi flood, and Europe may jeer as it likes at our mass production and our mass organization and our mass education. The safety of the United States is its multitudinous mass leadership. Hoover did everything he could to provide the means for relief, but he knew then, as we know now, America's greatest resource is its citizens and their boundless generosity, resilience, and hope. Notice nothing in there mentioned about the negativity of the Great Flood and how the blacks were treated and how they were ignored when the issue was brought to him by Robert Martin. And instead of taking action, he made a promise, hey, I'll help the blacks out any way I can once I become president. Just keep this under wraps for me. Don't let the media hear about it. And when I become president, I will do good things for you guys. And nothing happened. But yet, he gets a glowing praise in history about how he handled the 1927 Mississippi flood. Damn, y'all. I know this is a replay session for some of y'all, but damn it, put a 1 in the chat if you're picking up what I'm putting down. Let's continue. All right, so let's go ahead and get on to the fact where we start looking specifically at when the change in ideology occurred. So as of right now, everyone, you have seen the baseline of what got it started. Herbert Hoover was the catalyst for change. Now, this happened right at the time where we talked about, or at least where I mentioned, the crash in 1929. So Hoover didn't really do too much to curb anything or to release a lot of legislation during that time frame. So as a result, the ball was dropped, it kicked down the road, and it was Franklin Delano Roosevelt who happened to have picked it up. Now, there's been a lot of conversation about FDR's need to participate in civil rights for the most part, but civil rights was something that was coming into play. And remember now, blacks are pissed off with Hoover blowing off any efforts to assist. Matter of fact, him not even showing any need or desire to assist. Therefore, they migrated to the Democratic Party. Now, keep in mind, though, the Democratic Party is still the party of racists. Now, even though slavery had ended, we're still in the period of Jim Crow. So the slave owners were now segregationists who believed in separate but equal. So think about the 1865 Civil Rights Act, where they talked about having dining cars and inns and places like that, where blacks at first were to be allowed in, but after the end of the Reconstruction period, 1865 Civil Rights Act was all but wiped off the map. Now, there's information regarding some instances in history where there were individuals who made their play to stand out against the abolishment of the 1875 Civil Rights Act. Plessy is a name that comes to mind. I can't recall it right off the bat, but if I don't mention it from here out, look up the name Plessy, Plessey, and it should be linked to the 1875 Civil Rights Act and a few more actions about 10 or 20 years after. But take a look for that. Again, the name is Plessy, Plessey, I believe. Let's continue. So recall again the 1932 election of FDR had a lot of black support. But again, civil rights is now a buzzword. It is now a growing conversation inside the party. Now, we're going to have a conversation about the Dixiecrats and the Southern Democrats. And primarily, the Southern Democrats were the former slave owners and now the staunch segregationists. The Civil Rights Movement. Let's go ahead and just get into this here. Race and equality began to return to the center of politics in the 1950s and 1960s. Race did not necessarily fall into a party viewpoint at this point. Instead, it was more of a regional issue. Remember, we're talking again about the Southern Democrats. Southern Democrats and Republicans both opposed the early civil rights movement, while Northern Democrats and Republicans began to support legislation as the movement picked up steam. Now, here's a name that we're going to see a lot of here, Barry Goldwater, as we go through this. In 1964, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. We discussed that when we broke down all four of the Civil Rights Acts. In the 1964 election, Republican candidate Barry Goldwater publicly opposed the new law, arguing that it expanded the power of the federal government to a dangerous level. It was this argument that led to a final decisive switch. Black voters who had historically been loyal to the Republican Party because of the 1866 Civil Rights Act had already been switching to the Democratic Party. So now the thread is just falling out of the clothing at this point. People are just just tearing the clothing apart. All right, the threads are coming out. So luckily enough, because of the fact, I'm hoping that you guys can see the value in this of me showing you the Civil Rights Acts, but also pointing out who was responsible for the initial flux or the exodus of blacks from the Republican Party. You can see how this all culminates and comes together right about now. Let's keep it going. However, upon hearing Goldwater's argument against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the majority of black voters left the Republican Party in favor of the Democrats. They saw the Democratic Party as advocates for equality and justice, while the Republicans were too concerned with keeping the status quo in America. Now, also, I want you guys to keep in mind here, not mentioned in this article, but again, as I said, there's a lot of history that intersects. During this time period, Martin Luther King had made a big push to ensure that blacks voted for the Democrats because of what he saw in Barry Goldwater defying and fighting against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, you're going to see arguments in different places. And again, those arguments most likely will come from supporters of the Confederacy Lost Cause narrative that said, oh, Barry was not against civil rights. He just did not want the federal government to expand. You guys remember the Southern strategy? Goldwater may not have relied upon it too much, but still, the Southern strategy was always going to be in the background. And remember, Hoover utilized this. He appealed to the racism of white congressmen, statesmen alike. Southern strategy, keep that in mind. As the 60s and 70s continued, Democrats sought to reform in other places, such as abortion and school prayer. White Southern Democrats began to resent how much the Democratic Party was intervening into the rights of people, or at least that's how they saw it. By the 1980s, white Southern Democrats had become Republicans, and the majority of the South was now Republican. The Republican Party now, and they're talking about right now here in 2025, is solidly conservative, while the Democratic Party is the liberal one. So you're going to see in some other areas where they say that the final or the last bit of the flip is what they recall, or excuse me, what they call the ideologies between the two parties ended with the election of Ronald Reagan. So we're probably going to, yeah, we're going to get into that. I think, unfortunately, if this information is boring you folks, I apologize, but we're at 40 minutes right now, and I still have a little bit of ground to cover, but it's good information. You will enjoy this because I went out and found it, but not only that, because it's the damn truth. And it's the information that you are not hearing. Even right now, this information is glossed over. You do not have to worry about shying away from this conversation any longer because you're not sure. I hope I'm giving everyone a surety. Let's continue. Kara, lay down. Get off the door, babe. Yeah, that's the dog. All right, now recall where I mentioned the Dixiecrats, right? Now, the Dixiecrats were a party that popped up during the Democratic National Convention around July of 1948. The Dixiecrats were those folks who were still hardcore segregationists who didn't want to hear this nonsense about civil rights for blacks. And again, thanks to Hoover, who got the push started, FDR made sure that he ran with the ball. He took it down the field a little bit more. And now a full scale conversation about civil rights was now erupting inside the Democratic Party. So, where's a good place to start here? Take it down. Goldwater. Yes, let's do this. Regardless of the power struggle within the Democratic Party concerning segregation policy, the South remained a strongly Democratic voting bloc for local, state, and federal congressional elections, but increasingly not in presidential elections. Republican Dwight Eisenhower won several states in the 1952 and 1956 presidential elections. In the 56 election, the former Commissioner of Internal Revenue, T. Coleman Andrews, received just under 0.2% of the popular vote, running as the presidential nominee of the States' Rights Party. In the 1960 presidential election, Republican Richard Nixon won several southern states, and Senator Harry F. Byrd of Virginia received the votes of several unpledged electors from Alabama and Mississippi. In the 1964 presidential election, Republican Barry Goldwater, there's that name again, won all four states that Thurman had carried in 1948. But remember, Thurman did not win. Even though he was the pick for the Dixiecrat Party, he lost the nomination to Truman. In the 1968 presidential election, Republican Richard Nixon, or third party candidate George Wallace, won every former Confederate state except Texas. Thurman eventually left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party in 1964. And this was after the signing of the Civil Rights Act. But you've got many other references throughout history that'll be more specific about when he left. This particular reference, as you see, is doing a lot of bouncing around. But in the end, we know that there is a switch of the ideology, and that we'll see that, excuse me, we'll see that in here as well. Uh, so again, we talk about Thurman. Thurman eventually left the Democratic Party and joined the Republican Party in 64, charging the Democrats with having abandoned the people and having repudiated the U.S. Constitution. Read that as he was no longer listening to segregationists, or the party was no longer listening to segregationists and racists, and decided that blacks were men and unworthy of equal treatment as everyone else. So that's what a racist sounds like. Again, Strom Thurmond left in 1964. He subsequently worked on the presidential campaign of Barry Goldwater. Within the next few decades, a realignment took place whereby most conservatives, economic, cultural, and racial conservatives included, migrated to the Republican Party, with liberals on the same issues going to the Democrats, resulting in more heterogeneous national platforms. The southern states subsequently shifted over time to voting mainly Republican, with the Northeast switching to voting mainly Democrat. How many more times can I do this? I can do it a couple more. But again, as you see, the switch did happen. Do not let anyone from the conservative side bullshit you or back you down when they say that there is no ideology switch. You're seeing it for yourselves. And again, this is not my perspective. This is not my own personal narrative. This is not my opinion. This is fact. How many times do I have to say this? Well, I'm going to say it again. Facts do not choose sides because people do. And facts are not afraid of the truth. Keep walking with me. All right, so what else do we have here? We have, let's do this. Swap this around here. The Southern Democrats. Now, recall here, the Southern Democrats and the Dixiecrats, they're one and the same, except the Dixiecrats were just a faction who came to be because they were upset that civil rights was something that was now being discussed for Black people. So again, rather than me once again scrolling back up and down here, I'm just going to go directly to where the information is that we want to discuss. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a significant event in converting the Deep South to the Republican Party. Boom. All I do is win with the truth here, right? In that year, most senatorial Republicans supported the act, most of the opposition coming from Southern Democrats. From the end of the Civil War to 1961, Democrats had solid control over the Southern states on the national level, hence the term solid South, to describe the state's Democratic preference. After the passage of this act, however, their willingness to support Republicans on a national level increased demonstrably. In 1964, Republican presidential nominee Goldwater, there's that name again, Barry Goldwater, who had voted against the Civil Rights Act, as I mentioned previously, won many of the solid South states over Democratic presidential nominee Lyndon B. Johnson, himself a Texan, and with many of this Republican support continued and seeped down the ballot to congressional, state, and ultimately local levels. A further significant item of legislation was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which targeted for preclearance by the U.S. Department of Justice any election law change in areas where African American voting participation was lower than the norm. Most, but not all, of these areas, no doubt, where would you think it would be? Were in the South. Now, keep in mind, the Ku Klux Klan is still active, terrorizing Blacks, trying to keep them from the polls and from voting. The effect of the Voting Rights Act on Southern elections was profound, including the byproduct that some white Southerners perceived it as meddling, while Black voters universally appreciated it. Nixon aide Kevin Phillips told the New York Times in 1970 that Negrophobe whites would quit the Democrats if Republicans enforced the Voting Rights Act and Blacks registered as Democrats. The trend toward acceptance of Republican identification among Southern white voters was bolstered in the next two elections by Richard Nixon. Now, keep in mind, if I haven't mentioned it, I thought I did, Nixon would employ what is known as the Southern strategy. Oh, hey, take a look. Now, again, the Southern strategy, I'm not going to bring that up just yet. We'll come back to that, but let's keep where we are and focusing on the switching of the parties. So leaving out the Southern strategy, let's just pick it up right here. In the 1971 Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education ruling, the power of the federal government to enforce forced busing was strengthened when the Supreme Court ruled that the federal courts had the discretion to include busing as a desegregation tool to achieve racial balance. Some Southern Democrats became Republicans at the national level while remaining in their old party in state and local politics throughout the 70s and 80s. Several prominent conservative Democrats switched parties to become Republicans, including Strom Thurmond, John Connally, and Mills E. Godwin Jr. Now, recall where I said the article was not really following a direct timeline, so it jumped around a lot. So we're seeing that. But again, most of these folks that they're talking about right now left in 1964, depending on where you get your information from. But understand they left. In the 1974 Milliken versus Bradley decision, however, the ability to use forced busing as a political tactic was greatly diminished when the U.S. Supreme Court placed an important limitation on Swan and ruled that students could only be bused across district lines if evidence of de jure segregation across multiple school districts existed. So going through this here, you can see that the party switch here, although not really strongly mentioned here, we do know that it did occur. So again, as I said here, you can't really fight the facts when they're presented in front of you, but the information is here if you know where to look for it, right? So let's keep on going. The Southern strategy. Now, you've been hearing me mention this on and off. It started with Hoover utilizing strategy. We've seen that Nixon made use of it through his efforts to become president. But before we backtrack to that, let's go ahead and just make mention of this right here. Southern strategy. Southern strategy in the political history of the United States, a campaign strategy of the Republican Party, actively pursued from the 1960s. Well, actually, in fact, we saw that Herbert Hoover used this strategy way back in the late 1920s and the 1930s, well, especially within the 1928 elections when he was campaigning to become president. So the Southern strategy was already employed prior to 1960, but was still used through that time period and into what we now see today in 2025. A campaign strategy of the Republican Party actively pursued from the 1960s that initially sought to increase and preserve support from white voters in the South by subtly endorsing racial segregation, racial discrimination, and the disenfranchisement of black voters. The strategy has also involved directly promoting conservative views on immigration, taxes, social welfare, programs, law enforcement, and states' rights. That lovely phrase that you would hear from the Confederacy and the lost cause narrative. Does any of this sound familiar? Recall a series I did recently talking about the ideological subversion of the United States, where the Russians spoke about using subvertive tactics to change the culture and the value system of America. What if I told you, and I think I have, but if not, and some of you are seeing this for the first time, what if I told you the subversion of American ideology started after the Civil War and is still going on right now? Yeah, there needs to be another subject, another topic, hell, another series. I'm going to do one, all right? So look for that in a future video segment, but let's stay with what we got right now. So now that we've talked about the Southern strategy, let's jump back just one tab here, right? Just one tab. Now, just up here a moment ago, I believe the Southern strategy was just mentioned. Nixon, was it here? Or let's go back. Maybe I went to the wrong tab. Southern strategy. Southern strategy. Just a second here, folks. So much information. I've got myself thrown around here. Southern. Here we go. Southern strategy. Denouncing the forced busing policy that was used to enforce school desegregation, Richard Nixon courted populist conservative Southern whites with what is called the Southern strategy, though his speechwriter Jeffrey Hart claimed that his campaign rhetoric was actually a border state strategy and accused the press of being very lazy when they called it Southern strategy. Mm-hmm. Disinformation, misinformation, misleading statements, misappropriation of statements. It's nothing new. But notice how it was played down that Nixon was playing towards the racist tendencies of some of the congressional whites in government at the time. This will not be the last time you hear this information spoken of, all right? Let's keep going. By the way, we're doing good on time. We're at 55 minutes and 32 seconds. All right. All right, so we did discuss the Southern strategy. So, hey, you know what, folks? We've cleared some good time. Matter of fact, dare I say, we hit exactly where I wanted to. So, because of the fact that we've done so good in time that I've wanted to do here, I've got a video that's going to kind of wrap everything up and put a bow tie on it. So, this is going to be a video that discusses the issues that surrounded Barry Goldwater, and they talk about him being the final flip, which is the final stage of where we have Democratic elements of racism, segregationists, and so forth, who switched over to the Republican Party. Now, before I say this and get started, I want to say one particular thing right now. So, for all my folks here, if you are on Fatty's panel, you come to my show, or you're over on Hamp's panel at This Might Be Risky, shout out to you, Hamp, as well, if you haven't seen any of this. Recall how we're always talking about how the black man was forced out of the house during the early 1960s because of government government housing regulations. Now that we've discussed everything, everybody should be right on focus now. Recall once again, the Democratic Party up until 1965 was composed of the segregationists and the former slave owners, or at least the descendants of slave owners. All the racists were inside of the Democratic Party. So when you hear people talk about, oh, look what the Democrats did in the 1960s, they forced the black man out of the house and they separated the families. Who do you think did that? Now, this is that mirage, that smoke and mirrors, that distortion field that you will get from folks who will tell this story but not know the true ins and outs. So rather than me beat around the bush, if we ever have the conversation again, folks, and I want you guys to be clear when I say this, if we ever have the conversation again about how black families were broken up in the early 60s and how the black man was forced out of the house, understand that this happened because of the fact that the Democratic Party, yes, they were shit. The Democratic Party was responsible for that, but also recognize that the Democratic Party was infested with the racists that were there until 1965. So if you want to know who's responsible for breaking up those families, it would be the people who jumped the ship and became the Republicans that we speak of today. Or should I say, again, even in 2025, the children and descendants of the Republican Party who descend from segregation, who were the segregationists who joined the Republican Party that left the Democratic Party. The parties are not the same. So when you talk about the party of segregation nowadays, it is the Republican Party because that's where all the racists, the segregationists, and the former slave holding people with the mentality that blacks do not deserve civil rights and are not going to be equal to us went. The racists are in the Republican Party. Enough said. Huh. All right. So with that being said and done here, let's go ahead and do this. Let's get here to the part where we're going to discuss the final flip, Barry Goldwater and the final flip, as it's stated here. All right. Hopefully, I've got this in the right spot. That's close enough. All right. So fair use, fair use. Just a second. Let me make sure I've got the sound and everything. Pardon me, friends, as Fatty would say, just for a moment while I make sure everything is taken care of. Yeah, I think we should be all right. If we're not, I'll just work on editing. Fair use.
Barry Goldwater was born in Arizona, a state that didn't join the Union until 1912, so arguably imbued him with a different sense of nationalism than people born in older states. Initially interested in a military career, Goldwater was forced to take over the family business, Goldwater's department store, in the 1940s. In 1949, he entered politics via a seat on the Phoenix City Council before becoming a senator in 1952. He preached modern conservatism that heavily emphasized individualism, protection of private property, anti-communism, and a distrust of centralized power. Goldwater didn't have firm presidential intentions when he published his political creed and a small manifesto, The Conscience of a Conservative, in 1960. The book became a bestseller and a new Bible for conservatives. In it, Goldwater writes that civil rights, labor relations, and welfare all require the utmost vigilance and care to keep political power within its proper bounds. He points continually to the Constitution, arguing that it needs to be the rule of the land, not the modern decisions by lawmakers, courts, or politicians. He gives an example in discussing Brown v. Board of Education. In that landmark case from 1954, Goldwater cites Chief Justice Warren as saying, "We cannot turn the clock back to 1868 when the 14th Amendment was adopted. We must consider public education in the light of its full development and its present place in American life through the nation." To that, Goldwater writes, "The court said that what matters is not the ideas of the men who wrote the Constitution, but the court's ideas. The Constitution is what its authors intended it to be and said it was, not what the Supreme Court says it is. If we condone the practice of substituting our own intentions for those of the Constitution's framers, we reject, in effect, the principle of the constitutional government. We endorse a rule of men, not of laws." Because of his
All right, so take notice right there. We're seeing the character of Barry Goldwater, are we not? We're seeing him setting up the stage of him bucking civil rights. Now, the 14th Amendment that is being spoken of, that Chief Warren spoke of, is one of the enforcement acts that is still in place right now that Goldwater took it upon himself to not really argue the fact or steer directly and speak of the fact, but he created a narrative about the fact that he was able to put his own perspective on that appealed to folks, which was, let's think of it like being not a flat out dog whistle, but to let folks know that, hey, they're trying to defy what the Constitution stated. But the Constitution, recall, is one of the main tools or mechanisms that was considered when the Reconstruction Acts were put in place, or as they came to be based upon the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But be that as it may, we're starting to see that line here that Goldwater is starting to form that set him up to outright reject the 1964 Civil Rights Act. All right, enough for me. Fair use, fair use. Let's keep it going.
manifesto, Goldwater became a rallying point, not only for conservatives, but for segregationists and white supremacists as well. Republican voters put off by the New Deal decades earlier were also drawn to this new voice protecting individual freedoms and personal wealth and championing minimal government. In January of 1964, Goldwater announced his intention to run for president. Competition within the party came from moderate Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who won in the primaries, but Goldwater won the nomination in June, deepening the divide between moderates and conservatives.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
His "don't tread on me" philosophy appealed to voters who felt they had less control over their own lives and businesses than they would have if it hadn't been for FDR and the New Deal. During his presidential campaign, Goldwater voted against the 1964 Civil Rights Act, arguing it infringed on individual freedoms. He ultimately believed it was each state's own right to decide on segregation, pointing to the Founding Fathers' vision of America that kept certain civil rights down. On the prospect of Goldwater in the White House, Martin Luther King Jr. said, "I feel that the prospect of Senator Goldwater being President of the United States so threatens the health, morality, and survival of our nation that I cannot, in good conscience, fail to take a stand against what he represents."
And there you have an additional push that helped blacks leave the Republican Party and come over to the Democratic Party. Martin Luther King stood to the front and said, "I cannot, in good conscience, see supporting this man." The switch happened. All right. We've seen multiple instances of it happening, and we're even seeing prominent figures who are intersecting in time, like I said, all crossing each other, cross reference information, corroborating everything you want to talk about right here. Barry Goldwater has been damn near on each particular subtopic that we've talked about, hasn't he? And he's been quite popular. But again, the switch did occur, and one of the last few things that occurred here was Martin Luther King getting involved and letting blacks know, do not vote for this guy, vote Democrat. But keep in mind now, he was with Lyndon B. Johnson when Lyndon B. Johnson had signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, or maybe not with him when he signed it, but there were communications that they had after the death of John F. Kennedy. Fair use, fair use. Let's go.
Goldwater's team did something else crucial during that campaign. They had actor turned public speaker Ronald Reagan, the great communicator known for his gift of oration, film a speech.
The full power of centralized government. This was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also knew, those Founding Fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy.
The speech, as Reagan called it, or more properly, A Time for Choosing, was a hit, and donations to the Republican Party skyrocketed after it aired on October 27, 1964. But it wasn't enough. Goldwater lost the election. But the campaign did bring some victories, though they weren't immediately obvious. It sparked new trends for the movement conservatives that emphasized championing small government and individual freedoms, and they started eyeing Ronald Reagan as their next candidate, but he would have to wait. In 1969, Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's former vice president, brought the Republicans back into the White House. Nixon's
Now, recall when we talked about Nixon, remember I made mention of the Southern strategy and how Nixon would be using that strategy to appeal to the racist aspect of white senators, congressmen, and so forth. Pay attention. Again, history intersects, and you will find the same thing being mentioned multiple times if you look in multiple places. Fair use.
presidency coincided with a significant dip in Americans' faith in government. The war in Vietnam was worsening. The Cold War was at a point of détente, slightly, but it wasn't going anywhere. And civil unrest remained high. In this landscape, Nixon appealed to a voter base that resented civil rights and was fed up with anti-Vietnam protests and the growing hippie movement. He appealed largely to white, working-class people who weren't college-educated and had some ties to religious communities. With Nixon, the country really started separating into us versus them. You're either with Nixon or against Nixon. Heather Cox Richardson, an historian from Boston College whose newsletter I strongly recommend, puts the Nixon election very succinctly. It's that election that you really get the power of this racial backlash taking over the Republican Party and creating a wedge that is going to allow movement conservatives to take the party over by 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan.
Did I lie? Of course I didn't. I told you, folks, this is not my book report of opinion. This is only me providing you facts that most of you may have forgotten or have never seen it all because no one has pursued it to this level. And if they have, I'm just following up and I'm reinforcing it. But this right here, these are those little cracks in the ground that people step over and don't even see. Fair use. Let's go.
Nixon was succeeded by his vice president Gerald Ford, a moderate Republican from the old guard in the wake of the Watergate scandal. Democrat Jimmy Carter was elected in 1976. These three men presided over some pretty major events: the Equal Rights Amendment, Roe v. Wade, the Arab oil embargo, Nixon's resignation, the nuclear disaster at 3 Mile Island, the Iranian hostage crisis, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. All the while, the Republicans worked on softening their outward conservatism and honing their next candidate, Reagan. Leah Wright Rigueur from the Harvard Kennedy School says that in their private notes and in their private correspondence, they argue that they are explicitly aimed at winning over white ethnics, white religious groups, white working class, white middle class, white liberals, and moderates who might be afraid of conservatism otherwise. Coming after 2 challenging decades of social unrest, Reagan emerged as a candidate of hope for many Americans, ideologically fairly extreme but politically quite willing to negotiate. He inspired confidence in public speeches with promises of making America great again.
That's what we owe ourselves and our children. That's why I'm running for president.
Only one man has the proven experience we need: Ronald Reagan for president.
Make America great again. Sound familiar to anyone? There's one more slogan we'll talk about here, but just take this in. Make America great again. Enough said. Fair use.
President, let's make America great again.
He won in 44 states. This video isn't about Reagan's presidency or its lasting effects on the modern political landscape. For the purposes of our narrative today, Reagan's election as president in 1980 is the end of the flip. With Reagan, the movement conservatives found their excellent leader, someone who's
All right, so as she said, with Reagan coming into power, that was pretty much the end of the Exodus. So, did I miss that? Yeah, so basically what we see here now, there can be no question here. We have seen significant instances where the parties have changed ideologies. It's clear as a bell, clear as glass, how we want to see it. It's a done deal. I'm hoping everybody has seen this information for what it is, and it will make sense now when you sit back and you hear conversations. If you see anything on panels for most of you folks who watch these panel shows, or if you happen to read anywhere, you now have some knowledge that people sitting next to you, people on panels with you, have no concept of and cannot be shown. Now, whether or not you have the nerve to make it be known, that rests up to you. But understand one thing: I have shown you the truth. I've shown you the facts, and it's not fiction. I did promise you one more thing before we got out of here, didn't I? There we go. Tell me, is everybody familiar with America First? If you didn't know where Trump got that from, you can see he got it from a Ku Klux Klan. I don't want to say a rally, but he got it from the ideology of the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan stages an America First parade in Binghamton, New York in the 1920s. Hey, I think I've done all that I can at this point here. So again, I hope everyone who has been around for this replay watched it and they enjoy it and understand that you now have weapons at your disposal. weapons of the truth regarding the ideology flip of the Republican and the Democratic Party. From this point forward, if you happen to see me on a panel, if you join me on a panel, or if you have, excuse me, even if you happen to be in future live streams or even such as these, pre-recorded shows, make sure that you ask questions. If I don't have the answer, I'll look it up. If I have it with me, I'll give it right back to you then and there. But know this, you have significant knowledge right now in just this one particular point in time that is crucial, that lays the groundwork for everything else that comes after it, right? Keep that in mind. You guys now have that information. You know what time it is, right? Find somebody who knows somebody to tell somebody about what's going on over here. If you like it, let me know. Share it if you do. And subscribe if this is what you're looking for. As always, folks, thank you for joining me for the conversation. I appreciate you guys. And I'll see you in the next video. John Henry out.